Oh, that's probably the one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thanks, Paolo.
No worries.
Okay, so moving on to the second item on the agenda, which is open PRs. There is this one, which I've not seen before, about a secret builder for JAS.
Tom, I added these to the agenda. So I
Okay.
think these are there more than 1 month since any change. So maybe we should close these.
Right. I'll just have a quick read.
So this one is about adding the JAS configuration into a secret with the Scrum credentials. I think the other one is about something else in the user operator. I think we discussed for both that they would be useful and that it would be fine to merge them, but they were not updated with the comments and so on. So
Yeah, so that's a couple of months old, isn't it? Is it much work to try and get these merged, or are we just not interested in doing it anymore? Because I mean, the feature sounds useful still, right?
in general, but the question is whether we should keep the PR if someone else is then implementing it. I think some of them had quite a lot of comments and so on. Here is the DCO sign of missing, which we cannot really fix on our own. So yeah, if we think this is something what we should implement, then we should maybe convert them into issues and
Okay, let's have a quick look at the other one. Okay, this is, I have seen this one before about prefixing the user secret. Yeah, I think if they've not been sort of commented on for a couple of months, then probably trying to get them closed off is not a bad thing to do if they're not seeing any action. We should probably just, as a sort of politeness thing, just sort of leave a comment to say, look, you know, we'll close this within the week if there are going to be no more sort of progress with it.
So is this something what we want to have implemented even without the user interest? Should we then convert these to issues to keep the track of that and so on?
I think where we agree it's a useful feature, then converting them to issues at least means that we don't lose the idea.
Should I do it, or does someone volunteer?
I think if you could do it, Jakob would all be most grateful.
Okay, I will add it to my to-do list.
Are there any other open PRs which anyone wants to discuss in particular? Okay, so moving on, we've got an agenda item for KubeCon EU. The project pavilion there. Who added that to the agenda?
Yeah, so I added that as well. So I guess all the maintainers got the email that from Katie Greenlee, that as part of the virtual KubeCon, we can have something what they called, I think, KubeCon Project Pavilion or whatever, which we can sign up. And I think there are different levels of support in the Project Pavilion. And the deadline is today. So yeah, I think we should decide what is the level of participation that we want to have and what is the level of commitment. So I think the options are: one, we would like to host a project booth in the sponsor expo hall. This would allow the project to have a maintainer work the booth by engaging with attendees via chat, uploading videos, sharing links to important materials, and hosting downloadable assets. The other option is we would like to host project office hours via Zoom meeting to have flexibility in sharing our screen and have complex conversations surrounding the project that could be better conveyed outside a messaging system. And then 3, we would like to do a combination of a project booth and project office hours via Zoom. I think saying that we want to do the office hours, that's probably quite straightforward. At the end, that would not be that different from the community meeting. But I guess signing up for the virtual project booth, that would be probably require commitment, because someone would need to be online there, someone would need to follow that, someone would need to be answering the questions in chat and so on. The project pavilion doesn't seem to be open non-stop. It seems to be 4 days in the KubeCon EU week, and it's usually from 12:30 Central European Summertime till different times between 7 and 9 in the evening, Central European Summertime again.
So to me, it sounds like the office hours is probably something that we can more easily achieve, simply because it's a slightly lower level of commitment, and presumably it's a maintainer commitment in particular. Though I guess there's no problem with anyone else sort of joining in with that.
I guess everyone can join the office hours. I guess maintainers should be in the project booth.
What do other people think about this?
Do we have to commit to all 4 days of the project booth, or is there an option just to do a single day?
There's no option I'm aware of.
Okay.
So it's not in the form. So I personally don't have a problem to do, for example, one of these days or a few hours every day. But I probably don't want to spend 4 days in a row, my whole afternoon and evening with that. I guess nobody has really idea what does that really mean, right? So when we had something similar for the Red Hat Summit, I think nobody ever asked there anything for the whole time. So it might really be just kind of having a browser window somewhere open, checking every few minutes and not seeing anything. But it might be that there will be questions all the time. I guess I have no idea, and nobody really has an idea what does it mean until we try it.
So it doesn't mean that we will need to do some kind of, let's say, demo during the whole office hours, right?
No, so if I don't know how it will look like on the software perspective. So I mean, I expect the same features as the different expo booths would have Unreal conference, right? So maybe you upload there some YouTube video or add some YouTube link, and that will be playing there in an endless loop or something like that. Or maybe in this case, you add there some videos on demand or something. But I do not really expect that. I would not expect anyone to kind of be presenting anything there. But it might be that there will be people constantly coming and asking smart questions, stupid questions, and so on, right?
So my side, I'm sorry to say, sorry for you, but not for me, that I'll be on vacation, so I won't be able to join.
Given that, then, does it sound more like we shouldn't commit to the booth and instead just go for the office hours?
Yeah, I'm inclined to say that the office hours would work better for me.
And if we need to discuss rotations, etc., we can just move it to Slack or whatever.
Well, the office hours will be 1 hour meeting, right?
Okay.
I think it's going to be a better use of our time, and it also, I think, potentially for people that are interested, it gives them, you know, a particular slot to sort of aim for if they want to talk to us. So it's kind of a bit more sort of clear how to engage with us if people want to do that. So
Unless the slot is in the same time as 20 different office hours, right, for other projects.
well, yeah, but I mean, we still have this community meeting, so you know, I think we're
So,
fairly approachable and, you know, sort of
so
contactable as a project.
does someone want to fill the form in, or should I do it? Okay, I guess I should do it. So office hours only.
Thanks, Jakob. Okay, so moving on to the next item, we've got Strimzi API and UI discussion. Particular questions are whether it would be per Kafka cluster or per cluster operator, how should it be installed, and should it manage multiple Kafka clusters? So I don't know who wants to lead off on this.
Well, I edited there, and I guess I added that to one of the proposals. So for me, this really defines how the UI and the API, what should be there, how should it be structured, and so on. So I think, and I think it goes a bit with the next topic as well, which is about the security, because I think there's also difference whether the UI is running for multiple Kafka clusters at the same time, or whether there are kind of with 5 different Kafka clusters, you have 5 different UIs, because the authentication and authorization needs to be able to handle these models. So to be honest, for once, I don't think I have really a strong opinion how it should be, but I think we really need to have a clarity around this and understand how we expect this to work, because I'm not sure whether without that we can actually understand how exactly and what exactly will the UI be doing, and how the UI or the API server will be secured, and so on.
So I support that, and was actually the person that asked Jakob if he could, or basically that we can have a conversation about this security part of it. I mean, Jakob is correct. So I proposed the admin server part of the first proposal, and Matt proposed the UI part of it. But the problem is that both of them are very, very closely kind of linked. And obviously, depending on how we implement any of this, really depends on the security things that we're going to support. And there are things already in those proposals that are not covered by Strimzi currently. So, you know, we have to think about if we take authentication in the UI, how do we actually pass it on to an admin server? Then that passes on to the Kafka through the authorizer and all the rest of it. So getting a clear idea of exactly how those flows actually work, I think, is kind of essential. And we're going to possibly hit into similar problems later on. You know, so if you think about putting something like a mirror maker or a schema registry or something in there as part of Strimzi cluster, then how do you want the security to actually flow across for authentication and authorization? And also, you know, looking at things like the point-to-point encryption, so data in motion and data on the disks and things like that. So I think, so my proposal with the security thing really was that we need to step back and actually create some kind of reference architecture that we can all work to, so that everybody is clear as to how the security works across the board, and when we want to implement some new component, how to go or what we need to implement in terms of security on that front. And I'm really happy to be a person to kind of pull together the documentation for a reference architecture, but I really need help from Strimzi people to, or certainly people who have far more experience with Strimzi, shall we say, to pull the same thing for the current Strimzi security, how it's implemented, what is there, so we can start to map out what the requirements are and kind of have a discussion about how we solve those.
So, I mean, currently in Strimzi, the security is pretty basic in a sense, in that we just rely completely on what's provided by the API server, because it's just all in terms of custom resources, really. That's not entirely true, because we've got things like the bridge, for example. But what you were sort of talking about with being able to authenticate people and then pass that identity on through sort of layers, because we don't really have those sorts of layers at the moment. It's not really sort of been an issue up to now. And the bridge just sort of functions as a, just any Kafka client. So, it's quite simple at the moment. So I agree for what we're sort of contemplating with the UI and the API, now that we're sort of getting extra layers where identity is obviously sort of front and center to letting people have access to that sort of functionality. It's something that we're going to need to figure out, but I'm not sure that there's very much sort of prior art in Strimzi that we can lean on to do that.
I think even aside from the security side, though, I think first there's a need for a almost ideological decision around what a Kafka CR, what a Kafka kind is. Is it just about Kafka and Zookeeper, or is it all the supporting bits with it? Now, I think Cruise Control has sort of maybe set a precedent that it is supporting services as well. So I think that's the way I lean, but that then does say that there's a one-to-one relationship between admin UI and a Kafka cluster.
I don't think Cruise Control sets a precedent, because you have other ones, right? The bridge, connect, and so on.
Yeah, so connect, yeah, so fair enough. The connect was an example of how you can deploy something as a standalone piece. So it's kind of like, what is the vision for the Kafka CR? Is it the one single thing that everything could go into? Or is it actually, if you want a UI, you have a kind of Kafka admin, or whatever we call it?
No, I think
deploy standalone.
I think the vision is pretty clearly defined. Everything was tightly coupled with the cluster. That's in the Kafka CR right now, right? Everything what's not tightly coupled and what can be used on its own, that's kind of not in the Kafka CR.
But I think that's sort of the point I'm making.
Pretty much
is the vision we have for an admin API and UI something that is tightly coupled to a single Kafka cluster, or is it something that can sit above that? Because if we had a standalone admin, it could actually, you could maybe use it to manage multiple Kafka clusters, or you could use it to point at a vanilla Kafka cluster that isn't Strimzi. It's kind of which way do we take the admin?
Well, that's why I added the point to the agenda, right? Because if we decide that we have a UI and API per cluster, then ultimately they should be part of the Kafka CR. If we decide that they should be able to work with multiple clusters, then they should be separate, right? Kind of answering this question, I think answers where in the CR it should be. And then I think, for example, some points around the security, I think are similar, right? So build a API and in kind of, because it's used by the UI in transition UI, build that, for example, target the Kafka internals, or will it kind of be based on Strimzi? So for example, when managing the topics from Kafka cluster, does it use the Kafka APIs, the admin API, and does it create the topics in Kafka? Or does it use Streamzy and does it create the Kafka topic resources? Because so the difference there, for example, is that logically, if you are creating the custom resources and then let Streamzy consume them and use them, then probably the authentication should be based on the Kubernetes authentication. And you should, for example, have something like, I don't know, in the OpenShift land, usually OAuth is used for the authentication. So you use OAuth proxy to kind of use that users. Or in Kubernetes dashboard, you have a login window where you can pass the token or the kubeconfig file with the credentials, and that's used by the UI. So that would be the logical choice if we say that it should be creating kind of these Kubernetes resources. But if it works on the Kafka level, if it, for example, creates the topics using the admin API, then probably it should be using the same credentials as the other Kafka clients can be using. And then it's Streamzy, then it's really the kind of should have similar options to what Streamzy gives for configuring the Kafka cluster. And of course, the complication comes when you have kind of the hybrid cases where maybe you would like the UI to create and deploy new Kafka clusters or configure them, which would mean Kubernetes resources. But at the same time, you would want to create topics inside Kafka. So yeah, I think that's something what kind of gives the direction for the security as well.
So I think to answer one of those points, presumably one of the things that we want this UI to be able to represent and manipulate are consumer groups, which don't have a representation in terms of CRs at the moment, and so unlikely probably never will. So I would suggest that that is telling us that we should consider the Kafka admin API as being the natural target for this.
I like that personally, that approach. I think something more like Kafka Connect would be good, where you give it the configuration of where to go and where it can connect to Kafka, but actually it's kind of agnostic of Streamzy or Kube, and it could be a UI for any Kafka as long as you give it the right credentials and bootstrap address.
So I personally can probably live with that, but that probably gives also some limitations to what it can manage, right? Probably cannot manage users, probably cannot be used to create and manage the clusters. It's more UI for managing topics, consumer groups, and basically things inside Kafka, which I'm not necessarily have a problem with. I'm more pointing it out as a kind of a consequence.
Can you not support both at the same time? I mean, I could see it being a little confusing for a user, but arguably you could do both, couldn't you? Like interact with Kafka topics at the kube level or just Kafka admin client level.
You can, but as I said, that kind of complicates quite significantly everything around security, right?
That is true, yeah.
So then you have two options. Either you kind of deal with it that the users log in twice, or you will need the UI and the API server to kind of have its own authorization so that someone can configure it and, for example, say, yeah, the Streamzy API can create everything, but this particular user on the Streamzy API level, he can edit existing Kafka clusters, but he cannot create a new Kafka cluster, right? So I think that can be done as well. It just adds more complexity because you need to have some authorization models, some way how to configure these rights for these users and so on.
Is topics one of the main examples in Streamzy where you can do it two ways? Is it true that most other resources you either have to use the custom resources or you have to go the Kafka route? Are there any other examples?
I think that topics is the only way where it kind of synchronizes in both directions. And it's I'm not sure it works well that way, but yeah.
And the other thing to say is that both the topic and the operator, user operators, are kind of optional. So if you sort of build on top of them, then you're kind of making them less optional if you want to have a nice UI.
I do not think it's necessarily a problem to kind of say, hey, this part doesn't work if you don't want to use this other part.
I mean, what we're not really sort of saying explicitly is the extent to which the this sort of admin API would be prepared to sort of abstract over different ways of implementing these things based on the modular approach that we've already sort of outlined in the proposal. I guess that was sort of kind of the point that Sam was making.
So at some point we can even think that if some people would like to use the UI, it's even possible that they are not going to use the custom resource for handling topics and users, right? So we still have the topic and user operator are optional, and yeah, it's better using the admin client API so that people who want to use the UI doesn't need to use the topic and user operator, and the other one can just use the UI for doing all the stuff around users and topics.
So I personally
Maybe-
don't see any sense in the UI supporting any way to create users which is not powered by the user operator.
I think the other possible reason for making it a standalone CR is if you might want to change the version of it independently from Kafka. Like, does it help at all to be able to manage it independently, different lifecycle, different upgrades, different versions? I guess you could always override images even if it lived inside the Kafka CR, so maybe that isn't too much of a bottleneck.
Yeah, in general, I don't think it helps that much. The bridge is the example, right? So right now, when you do a new release of the bridge, of the HTTP bridge, then basically to get the support for it in the operator, you still need to do a new operator release.
Yeah, that's true.
To some extent, you can really just, as you said, change the image and use the new image. And if nothing changed in the configuration files and so on, then that works fine, right? But like in the last release, for example, there were some new things around logging, which basically didn't allow to just change the image to the newer version. And you need a new release of the operators to use the new bridge. So I don't think the separate CR versus part of Kafka CR plays any real difference there.
Okay.
I think a separate CR, there's a precedent for it if there is a genuine high chance or likelihood that people are going to want to use multiple admin APIs or multiple clusters for the same UI. I think if we want to take the stance of one UI per Kafka cluster, then we could make it part of the Kafka CR. It would maybe be simpler in some ways, and because of the security, we could just make lots of assumptions, etc., and we wouldn't have to deal with multi-all thing and stuff like that. But if we do believe that there's strong enough precedent for multiple Kafka clusters being managed by one UI, then I think a separate CR is the right thing to do. It was touched upon that maybe we should have one per cluster operator. I think that might be annoying to enforce or even recommend, as in, like, you can have multiple Kafka bridges at the moment, right? Like it might be analogous to having only one Kafka bridge, maybe not, but I think it would be better to say that you could have multiple UIs and they could both use the same admin API, right? And basically be the same. But
I guess the idea about having one UI per operator, maybe didn't expect it to use any bridge, any CR at all.
Yeah.
And didn't really expect it more to kind of deploy it in the same way as you deploy the operator, just with the deployment YAML.
interesting.
So when you think there might be interest in managing multiple Kafka clusters, would you expect them to be all in the same Kubernetes cluster?
Possibly. I mean, I'm not 100% sure. I'm saying this should inform our choices. I don't know either way, right? The problem is that we're guessing at this point, and maybe the results of the Strimzi survey that went out recently would actually help us inform this choice, right?
So the reason why I asked is that to run multiple Kafka clusters in the same Kubernetes cluster, it has some challenges around the versioning and so on, right? Yeah. I'm not saying it's necessarily a blocker, but it also means that I have a bit of trouble to imagine someone, for example, running the test cluster in the same Kubernetes cluster as the production cluster, which is the one where you would typically want one UI and kind of change, right? One operations team doing both, changing between the clusters. Whereas if you have more the situation that you have one OpenShift development environment and 20 different people run their own Kafka cluster there, then most probably those might deal better with having the UI per Kafka cluster, because they don't really care about the Kafka cluster of the guy sitting on the other side of the office space. So maybe a stupid question, what would be easier to implement in the API and in the UI?
So I don't know, Graham, if you want to speak to the UI, sorry, the API first, but so certainly from a UI point of view, I would suggest probably having the one UI and API per cluster is easier. There's less variables. One thing, for example, API versioning, making sure that, for example, the UI and the API are talking the same language from a syntax point of view, capabilities. Of course, that API is talking to, say, the Kafka. Different versions of Kafka obviously have different protocols, whatever it may be, capabilities, and that just makes things more complicated. I think ultimately, certainly from the UI side, it could work either way. It's very much a case of what would be useful to Strimzi and what would be, I think from a long-term point of view, the best way to go. If it went one way, of course, and we wanted to change it from a backwards compatibility upgrade point of view, that could be problematic. So much like a lot of the conversation so far, it's how many factors are we aware of which might lean us one way or the other. But certainly, I think technically it might be easier to go with the one UI, one API per cluster.
And I'd certainly say if you are going to have a UI managing multiple clusters, that you tightly couple the admin API and the cluster together, and rather just the UI part of it is looking across all the clusters, but the actual admin API, as I say, is tightly coupled to the individual Kafka cluster.
So what's the outcome? Are we going to sort of go away and come up with some sort of security architecture document sort of describing a sort of a vision around which we can build out these things?
Well, that was the proposal that I put forward, and as I say, I'm happy to help build that picture. But I think we need to kind of get a decision as to, the question that we've been discussing here is to, are we going to have a UI per Kafka cluster, or are we going to have a UI which manages multiple Kafka clusters? Because obviously those two things are going to have quite a big impact on what the end is going to look like in terms of the security, or the things you need to consider in terms of the security side of it.
So just to add, I would certainly say, at least from where the UI proposal is, understanding how the security would work, I think is definitely kind of the next step along the way. And I imagine exploring the various options scenarios will probably lead to a preferred way, I guess, of doing the deployment. So I'm more than happy, obviously, to help with that effort as well. To perhaps explore both options maybe and seeing which one seems the best way to go.
Okay, I think if you could, yeah, sort of present something either as a proposal or maybe at the next meeting, community meeting or something, based on some research of what the options are, I think that would be a really useful step forward.
But I guess we should still set the direction. That's what you asked for, right?
Yep, if you can.
Yeah, so I don't know. Does anyone have any strong opinions? I probably don't have a strong opinion, but it seems like starting with having API server per cluster and UI per cluster and focusing more on kind of the aspects of monitoring what's going on in Kafka and managing the things inside Kafka, instead of trying to start with some UIs for deploying clusters and managing the users through the Kafka user resources. Sounds like something as a more useful direction to me.
I think a consideration for at least, so I agree about the API, but the UI, the problem is with the, if we make the UI correspond to the operator, there's going to be versioning implications, you know, especially if you're deprecating API endpoints or adding new ones, etc. They won't exist, which might cause errors, etc. Like you should probably work around that, but I think having the versioning of a custom resource might edge that as a slightly better option. Again, I'm not 100% sure on that, but in my head at least, I think that that's slightly more preferable than to deploying with the operator itself. If there's a reason for it, then...
Not sure I follow now, sorry.
So if there's like a versioning, like specifying an image, etc., I think maybe a custom resource might make it slightly better than just deploying it with the operator. You said it would be
no, I didn't say per operator. Or if
oh,
I
sorry.
said that, I'm sorry, that was my mistake. I meant per Kafka cluster.
Okay, yeah. Sorry.
And to be honest, I don't think I really care whether it's separate custom resource, for example, for deploying it, or whether it's just a deployment, or whether it's part of the Kafka. I think that's more technical detail, which doesn't really define the design of the API and UI, right? It's really just whether you create two things to deploy it or one thing to deploy it. But I guess it kind of defines the direction for the API and for the UI. And yeah, I think in terms of compatibility, I think that's probably easier because it more couples them together, and you don't need to have the UI support 3 years back the different GraphQL or whatever API of the API server. You know that when you are doing the UI for the Strimzi operators 1.5, then they will be using the API version whatever, and that supports these calls, so you can really just build it based on that, I guess. That probably is something what makes life easier as well. And then if you first focus on the Kafka things, then probably the security should be probably based around something what can transfer to Kafka and be based on the kind of Kafka authorizers and so on, I guess, or? Now I really hate when I say something and then nobody raise the voice and says that's complete nonsense, we should do it completely differently.
The silence means yes, very wise, Jakub.
Because I have the bad feeling that nobody just wants to fight with me and my stupid opinions.
No, I think that's you know, my impression is that's a good sort of direction to set off in, and you know, we can explore based on that, and probably come back and discuss it again later when it turns out that there are sticky areas and so on. But from what you've just described, I would be happy if we started out in that direction.
Yeah, ditto.
Okay, good. So do you want me to put another proposal up to start drawing out an architecture for the security stuff, and then people can start chipping in, and we can expand that out until we get to a point where we've got something that we're happy with?
Sounds good to me.
Sounds good to me as well. If you would need any help, I should definitely be available on Slack and so on. So, yeah.
Okay, brilliant.
I was actually delivering some training this week, so I have no idea what's the latest updates on the different proposals we already have, because I didn't manage to read them. But yeah, I should have more time now because the training is finished. So if you need anything.
Okay. Can I ask a different question about the API and the UI, which is quite a simple one, really. We've already got a Strimzi admin repository set up in Strimzi organization. Are we going to have a second repository for the UI? And how do we go about getting one put there? Or are we going to put everything into a monorepo?
What do you prefer, guys?
I think we should split them, but we'll leave that to everybody to have an opinion.
Yeah, so we as a maintainers, or at least me, Paolo, and Tom, I think the government policy has something about some 6 months being maintainer for some GitHub rights for whatever reason, which we copied from somewhere. So at least me, Tom, and Paolo can create the repositories and can kind of open there. So CNCF just wants some things like have the license there, code of conduct, and so on. So if you want to have separate repo for both, there's, I think, absolutely no problem to open some Strimzi UI or something like that. We should probably just agree on the name, whether Strimzi-UI sounds good, or and then I can really just create it.
Okay, I mean, I think our preference between Matt and I is we separate them. And Strimzi UI is a great name. It says exactly what it is.
Yep, I agree. And my main motivation for putting in the proposal for having a separate UI repo is typically there's a lot of traffic, lots of issues, edge bugs, that kind of thing. So it just keeps everything nice and together. So I think Strimzi UI would be a great name and a good place to start. And what we can also perhaps start doing to supplement some aspects of the proposal as well is start to contribute kind of how at a lower level some of these bits might plug together, things like tests and build, just to kind of help paint the picture of how this thing could work.
Yeah, I think if you prefer separate repo, there's no reason in us kind of make your life harder and not follow that. So unless any of the maintainers are against it, then I would say that I can create this evening the repo, and you can use it.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, I'm totally fine, even because I think that you could even use, maybe, I don't know, in the future, if it's useful for that, I don't know, a CLI for interacting with this backend API instead of having the UI. So having both of them in the same repo doesn't make too much sense to me. It's better having them separate.
I think one of the consequences is that the things such as the releases and so on will be kind of independent, which means that there will be 2 releases instead of 1. But on the other hand, it means you can do new UI release without doing the API release, for example, and so on. So I guess that's probably not a problem either.
Does anyone have anything further to discuss on this subject? Okay, so last thing we've got on the agenda is the Strimsy survey, which we discussed last time. I emailed around a copy of the proposed sort of survey. So this is just a last call for any comments that people might have. The link is there in the agenda if people want to follow it. And if there are no further comments, then I'll forward that to CNCF, who will give us the benefit of their wisdom. I think they've probably done quite a few surveys, and probably tinker with it some more and hopefully get it into a SurveyMonkey survey for us. And then we'll be able to, start getting feedback from users, which should hopefully inform quite a lot of the decisions that we're going to have to make in future.
It all looks fine to me. Yeah, good work. I can't think of any extra questions. I think we put our comments and you added some extra questions and details. So it all looks good.
Do we need to add all the kind of things which are obvious but are not listed there, like all the different Kubernetes versions and so on?
I'm kind of hoping that CNCF will do that for us, but I'm sure there'll be the opportunity to, sort of revise what they come up with before it goes out.
Okay.
So,
Since you will be off now, will you be able to kind of communicate with them if needed?
I will try to tag at least Paolo on the issue, and if any of the other maintainers want to be involved, I can add their emails to it as well.
Okay.
Sounds like it's just you, Paolo.
Well, you can
Okay,
CC all of us, but I'm not a big fan.
You can CC me as well.
Okay.
Maybe one stupid question, given how many IBM people do we have here? Should we add IBM Cloud to the list of the Kubernetes distributions?
Yeah, I can do that.
I don't know if anyone has any kind of other significant thing which is missing here.
Well, considering the admin API and UI discussions that we've just had, are there any questions that might be worth going out asking about interest in a API or UI, or any features that they might like to look that aren't part of the proposal? I mean, that's a pretty big question, obviously, but is there anything that you can think that we could add to that now?
Yeah, it's tricky, I find, coming up with questions which are sort of open-ended enough that people can sort of say what they want, whilst being sort of closed enough that it's, you know, a tick box survey that takes 5 minutes rather than asking a lot of people's time. I think given that we don't even sort of, we know roughly that we want a UI, but I think you'd have to give people a bit more of a vision around what it was that was being proposed before they could come up with sort of a usefully concrete list of features that they might want.
Absolutely.
You've got an existing question there that says, what top 3 features? Is it worth breaking that down into features in the Kafka component versus new components?
So the intent behind that is really to sort of try to validate and order the existing roadmap. So obviously, you know, we're aware of the sorts of features that people that we interact with want, but we're hoping that this questionnaire will reach people who maybe don't show up on Slack, for example, and therefore they might have different requirements. And obviously we've got our own sort of idea as to what the importance of the features on the roadmap are. But again, it's difficult to really sort of validate that in any sort of way. It's just based on the interactions that we have. So we could try and sort of break that down. But I think the more we sort of break it down, the harder it gets to sort of when it comes to ordering the stuff on the roadmap that we've got. If we've broken it down too much, we sort of lose a sense of the global sort of order, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you, I just was scrolling, have a look, you haven't mentioned in any of the questions how useful things, I don't know if it's worth putting the roadmap in one of the questions. I guess it doesn't fit into documentation or anything, just to see if people are aware of it.
Yeah, on question 7, we did originally have a link to the roadmap, but the feeling was that maybe that would sort of box people in a little bit too much in a way. And really we're sort of, yeah, this is really much more an unconstrained, you know, what do you think, rather than this is what we already think, you know, vote for which one you think is most important.
So in general, I think the current roadmap really sucks, right? Because it's pretty much a bunch of random things that Jakub Scholz put together, I think. But yeah, I think originally the question was like, what are the top 3 features outside of the roadmap? But I think that, for example, doesn't really give us the insight on the prioritization, right? Because people can give us the features which are outside of the roadmap, but it will then not be clear whether, for example, the UI, which is on the roadmap, which I'm sure a lot of people will be asking for, how does it, for example, compare to something what the people will be asking for what's not on the roadmap? Is it more popular? Is it less popular? And so on.
Yeah, I think there isn't an obvious place to fit in asking a question about the use of the roadmap and things. And given that it's that the impression I'm getting is that you're hoping to kind of evolve it, it's not necessarily relevant to ask now whether or not people are aware of the roadmap. So maybe sort of leaving it, and then if you did a survey in a year's time or something, once you are happier with the roadmap, then it might be an opportunity then to find out if people are actually making use of it.
Yeah, I think kind of the idea about making the roadmap, making people more aware of the roadmap is not a bad idea, but I think it would be great to have some idea what to do with the roadmap. To, for example, so right now it's really just a GitHub project, right? I think it doesn't have any way for people to kind of thumbs up, thumbs down the features. It doesn't really have some way for the people, I think, to propose new features. So I think part of making people aware of that would be that we also give them these options to actually more interact with the roadmap and not really just read what's in there and be, it anyway doesn't say when it will be implemented much exactly and so on. So yeah, I think there's maybe a good point, but maybe there's some work we should do around the roadmap first.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if the surveys are useful and sort of seen as successful, then we'll look to do it again in future years. And obviously we'll sort of tinker with the format to some extent, but there's also value in being able to sort of compare results, you know, between years in order to spot trends. So yeah, but I think we need to just get the first one done first before we start trying to spot trends.
In terms of reach of the survey, is it worth trying to put a kind of banner on the top of the strimsy.io website as a kind of call to action for people to complete it? That might catch people that are just kind of downloading Strimsy, not kind of connecting via Slack or any mailing lists or anything like that.
Yeah, we can certainly do that. And obviously we can use Slack and the mailing list as well. Yeah, we should definitely sort of try to advertise it as much as possible because we can only benefit from the more people that fill it in.
Do we know when it's going to go out?
Not at this point. They do their annual sort of more sort of CNCF level survey in the autumn, so we're hoping to get it out before then. So I'm imagining at some point sort of over August, which is kind of a bad time because people are on holiday. I also don't know how long it would run for, presumably at least a couple of weeks.
If you manage to get it out before Kafka Summit, you could use some of the activity around Kafka Summit to encourage people to fill out.
That's an interesting idea.
I think the Open Policy Agent was giving away t-shirts for completing the survey. So if you find some rich sponsor for that.
I still have some t-shirts left that I can send to people.
And to be honest, the t-shirts were quite lame. Most of the t-shirt is advertisement for this Stira company, which is behind the project.
Yeah, I mean, I assume the CNCF probably won't go to any great lengths to try and advertise it. They'll just leave it for us to do. So, yeah, being able to tweet about t-shirts for filling in a 5-minute survey is a good idea. Okay, so I think we're at the top of the hour. Has anyone got any more questions?
So what's the conclusion, that the survey is okay and you should send it to the CNCF?
That's the conclusion that I've received.
Let's
yeah.
write it into the minutes to have it on
so
the
that you can
record.
give me an action after you've taken most of the actions.
I will not give you the action because, or I can give you the action, whatever, but you will do it. I mean,
okay, then if no one's got anything else they want to add, thanks very much for coming, and hopefully we'll see some of you in a couple of weeks.
Thanks.
thanks everyone. It was
very
a good
much.
discussion.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Cheers.